Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Adam Makes Beer. How's everybody doing today? If you are in the chat, you know the live experience always begins with me asking if audio is working. So if you are so kind, as I get into the podcast news today, please just give me a shout in the chat if everything is sounding good on your end, because it'll help me sleep better at night. Adam Makes Beer is now a podcast. Check out Spotify, Apple Podcast, and see all of the long-form brewer interviews we've done. After you subscribe, please leave a review and comment as well, because it really helps support the work I am doing. Also, if you are new to the channel or podcast, go to Adam Makes Beer on YouTube, click the playlist tab, and see tons of info, brew days, techniques, tutorials, now over 667 videos. As always, if you are getting value out of this content, please follow, rate, like, comment, and share with all of your brewing friends and craft beer enthusiast homies. And if you have the means and feel as if my content has benefited you, consider a channel membership for $2.99 a month. It gives you a priority for Q&A live streams and quarterly merch drops. Or please consider a super chat tip in the comments or chat. Also, if you are wondering, I am, if you're watching on video, if this is not on podcast, I am wearing the very summery. Summer is trying to, spring is attempting to spring here in the greater Cincinnati area. And we have some beautiful merch over in the Adam Makes Beer merch store. We've got everything from the ocean scene, the sunrise or sunset, whatever you want it to be, vacation Adam Makes Beer shirt. We have the 4 Elements logo, as you can see on my handsome mug. Listen, I mean, not this. I mean, you know what mug I'm talking about. So, yeah, jump in the store. We've got hoodies because, listen, even in the summer, you know that on those cool summer evenings, having the fire, sun goes down far enough, you need a hoodie. So hook it up and help me out. I appreciate it. Also, the April live stream Q&A podcast will be on Thursday the 4th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. As always, please make sure you are subscribed to the YouTube channel, and Instagram is a real help too. Facebook works as well because I cross-post between those two. But make sure that you subscribe and ring the bell, all the things you're supposed to do on YouTube, so you can stay up to date on when these shows are coming up. Every month I have folks asking when the next live stream is, the next live stream Q&A, things like that, because they have questions. Just follow me there. The best place to drop questions for me is in the comment section on individual videos on YouTube, and or DM me on Instagram. It can be a little difficult to keep up with them as they're coming in. So if you can just help me keep it to one source, that makes it easy. Speaking of making it easy, I'm basking in my segue. Blickman Engineering has been the pioneer of nano brewing, and they have helped hundreds of successful breweries achieve their dreams since they started with 1-barrel systems in 2006. Now offering a full suite of brew houses, up to 15-barrel skidded and insulated, matching cellaring equipment, keg washers, grain mills, and more, sized specifically for the nano brewer. Blickman Pro brewing systems are competitively priced without sacrificing quality, and the simple design and factory direct support from our brewing experts gets you up and running faster than anything else on the market. When you're ready to go pro or just kicking the tires, be sure to reach out to them for expert advice and a partner to help you through it all. Turn your dreams into a reality by reaching out to Phil, Tom, or Josh at ProSeries@BlickmanEngineering.com. Again, that's ProSeries@BlickmanEngineering.com. Blickman Engineering Pro Brewing is proud to be the equipment sponsor of this channel and is committed to helping every brewer, no matter where they are in their journey. I'm still feeling good about my segue. It doesn't help me out on this side because I've spent too much time thinking about it. But without further ado, please help me welcome John Plamer, author of How to Brew and editor-in-chief of the Master Brewers Association. He is a frequently invited speaker and international beer judge. I don't need to introduce this guy. You know who I'm talking about. You've heard him talk about water. And I can also tell you this. I've had the pleasure over the years. Somebody actually just shared a memory on Facebook from maybe 10 or 11 years ago when John and I were at the same judging table back in Michigan for, at that point, I think it was called the World Expo of Beer homebrew competition.
Could have been, yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And we are on the same table judging together. And honestly, John is consistently one of the kindest, most approachable folks in the industry. And so I'm excited to chat with him today, man. How you doing today, John?
I'm doing great. It's really nice to be here. Good to be talking with you again.
Definitely, man. So it's been a little bit. I chatted with you. I think we bumped into each other at CBC in Nashville.
Yeah.
We chatted there a little bit. Obviously, we mentioned all the books and the MBAA stuff. What's some of the most recent stuff you have going on right now in the beer world?
Well, I've got the Cincinnati Beer Fest coming up next week. I think they're calling that Copa Pacifico right now.
Okay.
And it's a great competition. Breweries all over Mexico send their beers there. They usually get 1,000 entries. And then after that, they have the Beer Fest, which is like 2 or 3 days, all craft beer, local food, incredible Mexican cuisine, and like 5 band stages going on. So, I mean, it's just one of the best beer festivals I ever go to.
That's awesome. Is this did you say that this is in California or is it in Mexico?
It's in Mexico, Ensenada, Mexico, which is like an hour and a half south of San Diego.
Okay. Man, that sounds fantastic.
Oh, it's fun.
So what is you've participated in this before?
Oh yeah. I was one of the originals. They invited me to their very first beer fest. And we spent the afternoon after I crossed the border, going around to various pubs and collecting their beers for the competition.
Yeah.
But it's been a real treat over the last, I guess, 12, 15 years, seeing the Mexican beer scene progressing, the beers improving each year. And, these days, Mexico makes top-notch craft beer. They really do.
That's interesting. So what are some of the stylistic things that you see popping off there? Is it kind of the same of what you might be seeing in California or different parts of the US or?
Yeah, I mean, that's the funny thing. I mean, I every year I travel Mexico, Central America, South America, all over. And everybody pays attention to the beer scene in the United States. So as soon as a new style comes out here, they're copying it or trying to emulate it. One of the best brute IPAs I ever had was in Mexico.
Really?
And good hazies. Of course, they've got everybody south of us has excellent access to fruit.
Yeah.
So I've had outstanding fruit beers over the years. Catarina sours, as well as the classic styles too, whether it's, West Coast IPA, Doppelbock, Abbey styles, you name it, they're brewing it and they're doing it really well.
Sure. That's really interesting. Yeah. I don't know. I always think it's interesting. I was talking to another brewer on, I think it was LinkedIn the other day, and he's brewing out in Belgium, and he was talking. I asked him, what styles he had going on, and of course, he said that he had his classic Belgian styles, but he was saying, he does get a chance to try to fold in some of the different styles that are popping up, that have popped off over here in the US a little bit, as far as some of the hoppy hazy stuff, but sometimes with a little bit of a Belgian angle to it. So
like it should be, really.
Sure. Well, absolutely. Right. And I think that's one of the things, I think it's one of the things that, as much as I can As much I'll say it like this: if there's a reason for me to stay rooted as a brewer, as far as my ego goes, it's the primary thing is, first of all, people have just shared information with me. It's not like I'm out here. It's not like I'm out here reinventing the wheel, right? And on some level, I feel like, maybe you can try to color outside the lines a little bit, but the number of people that are actually, going out and shaking up the scene, that stuff is few and far between. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
So what has been being involved in a festival like that and in that judging scene, because you've been judging for how long, John?
I guess I really started judging, late 90s, early 2000. Yeah. Um, but ever since the Water Book, which was 2011.
Was it that long ago?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
That's when I really started hitting the scene.
Yeah.
And, because, that's the point where in 2011, I gave up my day job, and my wife said, go do your beer thing.
Yeah.
And so then I was, freer to travel.
Sure. Supportive wives are a good thing. That's a beautiful thing. That's a beautiful thing. So you're kind of referencing, the former day job, and I didn't realize that you're able to kind of switch up. I'd always wondered kind of what that time split was like for you. What was your path into the industry? What were you doing? What were you doing before the beer thing?
Well, I was in aerospace for a number of years. Worked on the space station for McDonnell Douglas, and that was soon after college. And so moving out here to California and realizing that they had never heard of dark beer out here,
Sure.
it's like I should brew my own. And so that's when I started researching home brewing and found a home brew shop nearby and started brewing as a hobby.
Mm-hmm.
First batch was terrible, and so my engineering mind started. It's like, okay, what did we do wrong? What went wrong here? And just started digging into the process as an engineer does to what are the milestones we're supposed to hit? What are the goals at each step of the process that we're supposed to nail in order for this all to turn out right? And that that kind of that project appealed to me.
Yeah.
That kind of trying to gain understanding of how does this brewing process work? How can I optimize it, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. What do you? That's interesting to me. So I'm assuming, if I'm remembering correctly, you either have in the past or maybe still do. Are you still tied to any homebrew club?
Yeah, I still, I guess it's kind of honorary, but Crown of the Valley Brewing Club in Pasadena, northern LA County.
Was that club around when you were first getting in?
Yeah, well, I guess it was about 5 years after I got started.
Okay.
That we moved, and
Sure.
that's when I joined Crown of the Valley around 94, 95.
Yeah, I think the community aspect is one of those things that really, first of all, I think it keeps people in the game because, as you mentioned, I remember the first batch of beer I made. It was an extract batch out of a box, like the LD Carlson box with the 50-year-old Cooper's yeast and whatnot.
Yeah.
And my palate was so uninformed that in order for me to be able to taste anything wrong, it had to be astronomical. All right. So anyways, I remember opening up that first beer after it, probably far too soon, but anyways, it had plenty of carbonation. But anyways, I mean, it was definitely beer. It wasn't great. And it was crazy oxidized. And so I actually went back to my How to Brew book, and I started going through the off flavors, right? And then being able to see where that is. And, the area I lived in, there was not a really a super active homebrew club. And so for me, it ended up becoming, essentially the Brewing Network and the Brewing Network forums, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But I think that's one of the things that really helps to keep people plugged in, because when they do have that first bad experience or whatever, or they know that the beer isn't that good the first time somebody makes it, to have that community of people is such a big part of it.
Indeed. Yeah, yeah. And it was for me too, because I mean, I think we all joined a club at least with some level of confidence that we know what we're doing. And then you meet, the stars in the club, and it's like, wow, this is really good. How'd you do this?
Yeah.
And it's like, oh yeah, I got my rusty bucket here, and I do this and that, and it's like, okay, it's surprising how great a beer some people can brew with minimum equipment. But it's all in the attention to detail, preventing oxidation, freshness of ingredients, recipe proportions, and especially, the fermentation, because you can't have a good beer without a good fermentation.
Sure. And I'm not super plugged in on the homebrew side anymore, but starting to do the YouTube stuff, I definitely do have, listeners, viewers that are brewing on the homebrew side. And something that I didn't know that has popped off has been pressure fermentation at home. People fermenting either in cornies and the equipment has gone nuts on the homebrew side since I've quit homebrewing. It's really wild. Are you still homebrewing at home? Do you have any thoughts or takes on some of the pressure fermentation stuff people are doing?
Yeah, I'm a pressure fermentation skeptic, because historically, traditionally, however you want to frame it, beer was open fermented for the first 90% of history.
Yeah.
And so it's only been the last 100 years that we've started with the enclosed fermentations and the conicals, and pressure fermentation arose as kind of a side effect, if you will, of the trying to prevent oxidation. So while pressure fermentation does decrease esters and therefore allows you to brew a beer warmer than you would be able to otherwise without overpressure, I still wonder, and I've had side by sides, and I'm not convinced that it's the same beer. I taste differences. So I'm like I say, I'm not a fan of it.
Sure.
But there are so many tools you can use to brew a good batch and ferment a good batch. My preferred method is to switch up yeasts. If you're trying to brew at 80 degrees Fahrenheit, well then go to an ale strain that has been shown to perform well at those warmer temperatures.
Yeah.
Or go to a Kvike strain, and maybe get a firm blanket and wrap it around and get that fermentation up to 90 or 95, where the Kvike will work very well at that temperature.
What's your experience been with that yeast? Is it because when I was working at a small pub, it wasn't even a 1-barrel system. It was I was doing the whole Dogfish Head handsome Italian routine. What was he brewing on? The Savco. Yeah, the Savco. Yeah. So I would turn that 3 times in one shift for a barrel. Wow. Okay, so believe me, man, there was we'll call it a frenetic pace for the first 2/3 of the day. That maybe the first 3 quarters, and the last quarter it was a little more laid back, but there was always something going. Now that place had no temperature control, plastic fermenters. It was pretty wild. So I ended up playing quite a bit with Kvike yeast, trying to see if this is something that can be
Mhm.
usable in this situation. What's kind of been your take, because Kvike was something that was really, really hot on the pro side for a period of time.
Yeah.
And I feel like maybe that has dropped off some. Where's that wave at from your experience, maybe on the homebrew side? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's still popular, but yeah, I mean, it really doesn't perform well below 95.
Mm,
90 to 95 is kind of like that last air regime.
mhm,
It's much happier at 100, 105. So I brew a lager style, kind of a Dunkelbach. It's one
mhm.
of my favorite homebrew recipes, and I've done it with Kvike, but I need to ferment at about 95.
Yeah.
And and that beer turned out really well. I mean, the ester character that Kvike has, it being a little bit fruitier than a typical ale yeast,
Yeah.
um, worked well with that dark beer style.
Yeah.
Um, and but I also brew that with 3470 and
Mhm.
other. Just I pick a yeast depending on what my ambient temperatures are in the garage.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a smart way to do it, and that's one of those things. I think it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing to have experience with, because it's a tool belt thing, right?
Yeah,
Like, if depending on what your fermentation parameters are, there's options.
yeah,
You know what I mean? And I do think it opens up the game to people that are in, especially in warmer climates.
yeah.
It's
And yeah, there's kind of a no man's land between, say, 75 Fahrenheit and 95 Fahrenheit, where there's really not a good choice in that range.
sure.
But you go to tropical climates, um, where ambient can be 90 and 95 degrees, then
Yeah.
Kvike is really a godsend there.
Yeah. Yeah. So jumping back just a little bit, I think it's interesting that obviously you have the engineering background. Kind of what skill set do you think or how do those skill sets dovetail with what you do on the beer side today?
Yeah. Like I said, I look at the brewing process with an engineering mentality. I'm trying to figure out how this works. What do I have to achieve here to get a good result here? Later on in the process. And when I was writing How to Brew, the very first edition I wrote that. I started it in like 1995 and finished it about 2000. And the publisher and the editor at the time was looking at my chapters and going, "Yeah, we need to teach you how to write." And so they gave me a book called On Writing Well, which is
Okay.
all about active versus passive phrasing in grammar and et cetera, et cetera. Um, and then he said, "Let's take each of your chapters and work them into a magazine article."
Hmm.
And so that had me rewriting, and they would ask me questions. It's like, well, is this always true? And it's like, oh, I don't know, I'll have to check that. And so it got me to rework all the material in a very positive way,
Yeah.
and really improved it. So when I eventually did publish the green or the online version and went to the hard copy, I was honing my writing skills and learning to write actively versus passively.
Hmm.
Active writing is where uh, you state kind of like the nugget, the nugget of knowledge you want to talk about first, and then start qualifying it, rather than doing all your qualification in the first part of the paragraph and finally get into the point at the end of the paragraph.
Yeah.
That's a very tiring sort of prose to read. Very common in fiction, very common in casual magazines and so on. But when you're trying to learn something technical, it's much easier to say, okay, the yeast will die after 24 hours, and then with that premise in mind, now you can start qualifying that and explaining that, and it all makes much more sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. I remember a couple months ago, I talked to Mitch Steele, and I had been listening to different interviews by him in preparation for that podcast, and I was just so impressed with how eloquent isn't quite the right word. And it's not that he isn't eloquent, but he speaks so well.
Yeah.
He's confident, right? And John, you've been doing video audio content for a long time. Like there wasn't
Yeah.
butterflies before you were jumping on the live stream tonight. You know what I mean? But
Right.
like, and so I asked him about that, and he said when he was at AB that he actually had to take like public speaking courses. Because in order to have your project met there, or have your project taken up, you had to effectively be able to communicate it to a very large organization.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think things like that are interesting. Now, you mentioned that, so your working day job at the time, you're sending things into space.
Yep.
And then also as a side hustle, you're writing books and websites, correct?
Yeah.
How many hours a week? Somebody just asked me just recently, because somebody asked me, because I do call this a side hustle, and it's something that I love. I have a full-time job in the brewing industry, but I love doing this. It scratches the education itch that I from when I left teaching and whatnot. So it's very cool. But they asked me how many hours a week I spent, and I said, I don't know. You have to ask my wife. My wife is still happy with me, and my kids are too. And so I know I have enough balance right now. Well, how much time were you spending on this, man? Because that's no joke.
Yeah. Well, the kids were small, so they would all go to bed at 9, and then I would stay up till about 1 every night.
Are you a night owl?
I was then.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear that.
Yeah. I was getting, I'd be up till about 1, and then I'd crash till about 6, and then get up for work. But I was young. I could do that kind of thing.
Yeah, young guys can do that stuff.
Yeah.
Well, that's wild. So, were you writing on weekends too, like weekend hours and everything?
Yeah, all weekend. I mean, well, to explain, I put up the website in 2000, and after like a month or so, I mentioned to my wife that it's like, oh yeah, the website's getting lots of hits. Everybody really likes it. She goes, oh really? How much money are we making? And it's like, oh well, we're not making any money. It's free. And she goes, what? You mean 5 years of ignoring the children and we're not making any money off of this? So that's how the hard copy came around.
No, that makes sense, man. That makes sense. And so once you had the website, and then you converted that to what you call, version 2, I think that's so I have this one.
Yeah, that's the blue one.
Okay, that's the blue one. And I think, is mine? No, maybe mine isn't. I thought that potentially mine was an autograph copy, but I'm gonna say I maybe loaned that one out, never to be returned. But this is, if you can't see on here, this book has the trademark I'm brewing dirty thumb mark on the side where you're thumbing through stuff. If you don't have this book, and especially if you're just starting, even if you feel as if you're on the intermediate level, I think there's so much good stuff in here. And now you have volume 3, or version 3. How long did it take you to go from the website to the book? Just
a year.
Okay.
I cranked through it, and I did all the layout myself, and self-published. Because the reason I self-published at the time was I talked to the distributors, LD Carlson, Steinbart's, and others, and they just said, yeah, the book market's not very strong. And so they really didn't, I mean, and nobody was looking, talking to Brewers Publications, they weren't looking for a comprehensive book. They felt that that was out there
Mm-hmm.
with Charlie Papazian and so on. They were looking for a thin, book to hand out with kits at the store.
Yeah.
So that's why I self-published initially. And then, 5 years later, talking to Brewers Publications at the Homebrew Conference, and they said, oh yeah, we'd be interested in your next work. And it's like, well, I would like to revise How to Brew.
Yeah.
And so they jumped at it, and that became the Blue Book. That's
Beautiful. Yeah, no, that's very, very cool. And it does, because I'm kind of in this place now where I just recently I decided to scale back a little bit, because I do a daily YouTube video. And I was trying to also do daily YouTube shorts as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's when after a month of doing that, I just hit a wall, and I said, listen, let's go back to just 365 videos a year, and maybe sleep a little bit better at night. But yeah, so one of the things that I think is, because I'm just getting to this spot where I've been putting information on YouTube for, I think, like 21 months right now. Okay. Tell me a little bit about what you think has been like the key to the success that you've had in the brewing side of things.
Access to information. Both in personal networking, meeting other brewers, going to breweries, talking to people. MBAA, Master Brewers Association of the Americas, and the ASBC, American Society of Brewing Chemists. Way back, I don't know, I guess, when I was working on the Blue Edition, and trying to refine the information that I had in How to Brew. Mm-hmm. And I joined both societies and started accessing their archives, looking up enzyme ranges and best practices and all of that sort of thing. And that gave me such a step up in terms of, understanding how the whole brewing process fit together, because, at that time, the internet was still in its infancy. Mm-hmm. You would have a few papers out there, but, nothing really comprehensive. So that helped, give me an overall picture of what we were trying to do. And then, emailing the authors of papers that I was reading. It's surprised. Well, as the brewing community is so tight, and so happy to help each other, and I've got a bunch of funny stories of, people I met along the way and calling them up at all hours, and find out that this, brewing scientist is pulled over to the side of the road with his family in the car talking to me about enzymes, because I happened to call. It's like, I'm so sorry, but no, it's great. It's, and asking someone was like, oh, you know what the gelatinization temperature of rice is? And they're like, oh, so-and-so would know that. They're in Sweden. I'll give you their info, and I'm, emailing around the world, and people are responding.
Sure.
So, it was just the community that brewing has just makes all this possible.
Yeah.
And that's partly why I do what I do, because I'm trying to share that same joy of learning with everyone. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny because when I go to a conference and I run into somebody that's watching the content that I'm putting out, they're always so kind and gracious. But I don't think people understand that, it's a thrill to be able to just share like the small little sliver of my experience with other people, right? Because it's always like I don't know, dimensions of scale or on some level, like, because to me, I'm not the most experienced professional brewer. I'm not the most schooled professional brewer, right? But for different people, I've been doing it 13 years. There's things you learn, right? And I don't know, it's enjoyable to be part of that process of helping to pull people up, or because you've been pulled up before, right? So that is definitely one of the enjoyable things about it. Let me start bouncing a few questions, because I know we're going to have some from the chat. And so, John, I'm not the best with water. I know I am not the first podcast host that has told you that. But I'm going to explain to you what I was doing at my last brewery. And I want you to tell me how broken I am as a person or as a brewer. Okay. So when I explain water chemistry to people, the first two, the first two bullet points I tell them is, you want charcoal filtration. And you want to be able to manage your pH with the food grade acid. Okay. And then really beyond that, I think maybe it was you that said years ago that the water chemistry is the seasoning, the salt and pepper. For a dish, you can either, do you remember saying that?
I've been saying something similar to that for years. So yeah.
Well, it's a great analogy. So take ownership of it. And but no, it's true, because you really can make a dish great with the right seasoning, and you can absolutely punish a dish with too much. And so what I have been doing, so I was just at a brewery called Cartridge. We were in a situation where and I might be saying this wrong, but I believe the alkalinity of our water was so high, it was very difficult to bring the pH down with acid.
Yeah.
Does what I said is what I just said sound like? Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, yeah. The Midwest has high alkalinity. Yeah.
Yeah, it's wild. So anyhow, what I was doing is I was basically tracking that. I found that I was getting my best clarity using the Brewing Water software and having a water readout from Ward's Labs. I was getting my best clarity with my beers when my final calcium in the beer was anywhere between 80-90 parts. And then I would manipulate up or down my chloride and sulfate. And that was really it. For my hazy stuff, I would push that chloride way up, because that's what so many people are doing. But other than that, it would be more measured. And in general, I was using more chloride than sulfate. Okay. And so it's a very simple approach. Does that sound like a reasonable ground floor? I don't have to understand anything about chemistry approach to water chemistry.
Yeah, absolutely. The bane of brewers is alkalinity, because especially in the Midwest and in similar parts of Europe, where you have alkalinity from the limestone seas of millennia ago, the alkalinity buffers the mash pH. And so we, as brewers, we try to get our mash pH down to that 5.2 to 5.6 range. The amylase enzymes convert starches to sugars most efficiently at the upper end of that range, 5.8 to even 6. But the trouble is, when you're at pH of 6, that's where you start to get leaching of tannins and silicates from the grain husks. So we bring the pH down a little bit to avoid that, get a better tasting beer. Conversion is still really good. We just avoid the astringency. So that's like the first priority is getting our mash pH in that range for a good conversion, yet avoiding astringency.
Mm-hmm.
After we've done that, now we can look at what salts are we adding to do this. Are we adding calcium chloride, calcium sulfate, magnesium sulfate? Balancing that sulfate to chloride ratio to accentuate the style we're making.
Mm-hmm.
As you say, hazies with more emphasis on a sweeter malt character to round out that beer. You're going chloride heavy.
Mm-hmm.
West Coast IPA, on the other hand, where it's hoppiness and an aggressive bitterness, there's where we're going with the sulfate heavy.
Sure.
And that's essentially it. I mean, you can go a step further and saying, okay, what is the mineral structure of this style?
Mm.
Is this a soft style like Kolsch, or is it a more robust style like Pale Ale or IPA? Mm-hmm. And how much salt, how much mineral character are we putting into that water to support those beers' flavors? That's what I call mineral structure.
Sure. Are you somebody that enjoys chasing historical water profiles when you're brewing different beer styles?
I used to. When I was first learning this, I was thinking, okay, that's the bee's knees. This is how that worked. But then, other people helped me understand that it's really not. I mean, because there's no single correct answer when it comes to cooking, is there?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Everybody seasons their stuff different.
Mm-hmm.
Your grandmother,
Yeah.
There's no perfect single recipe. But when it comes to seasoning, we are like, we got to get the mash pH right. Mm-hmm. Once we've done that, now we're playing with the seasoning, sulfate and chloride, and the amount of sulfate and chloride to really reinforce that beer's character as appropriate to the style. So again, soft beer styles, Bohemian Pilsner, Kolsch, other soft beers. We're looking for a light mineral profile, delicate flavors. Mm-hmm. And then more aggressive beers, pale ales, IPAs, there's lots, pick one. But now we're adding a little more salt to make those flavors a little bit more robust. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's about as complicated as it really needs to get. So my education when it came to chasing classic brewing profiles and was understanding how did that city's water integrate with that local style. A great example is Irish Stout.
Yeah.
Guinness Stout. When that brewery first started up, they were brewing with their local high alkaline water. Mm-hmm. They were adding, this dark malt, the roast barley to help. And this is 200 years before the advent of pH.
Yeah.
But they could see the results in their wort and in their fermentations. So they knew that by adding dark malts to the mash, they got better conversion.
Yeah.
And better flavor. Yeah. And then this is so wild. I mean, the fact that they didn't have a lot of the tools, they didn't have thermometers. Yeah. For instance. But anyway, so they're brewing with that local water. They're developing the Irish Stout style with roast barley. Mm-hmm. And then about 25, 30 years into the life of that brewery, they said, hey, we can't supply enough water from our local well. Mm-hmm. They just completed this canal 100 yards over there. Let's pull water from that canal that comes from up in the mountains. It's very clean water. And they started doing that. Completely different water profile, low alkalinity. And so what they did, and they continue to do to this day, is they mash the base malt separately from dark grains. Because, again, it was a matter of understanding the effect of mash pH on their wort.
So I was a history teacher back in the day, and to me, that's one of those it's one of those amazing things is to see how beer style because when we talk about evolution, usually we're talking about life forms, right? But to see the evolution of beer based on locality, right?
Yeah.
That's always one of the things that's so fascinating to me. Ultimately, what works ends up willing out, right?
Yeah.
And so it's so cool to see that what we sometimes think of as a very human or life form oriented concept, applying it to the evolution of a beverage. Maybe I get too
Yeah.
excited about that stuff. That stuff's pretty sweet to me.
I agree.
Well, yeah. So that's fascinating. And so I have another curveball to throw at you about my brewing situation when I was at Cartridge. So I have this high alkalinity water. I have to use tons of acid in order to bring that pH down. And I had a dear friend of mine who brews down in North Carolina. He came up and he tasted my beers, and he tasted them blind. And I had 4 or 5 lagers on at the time. And it was about 6 months prior to that, he really started getting after me and saying, "Hey, listen, I just started adjusting pH on my sparge water, and I've taken a big leap in the quality, especially of my light beers." Right? He said, I'm not getting the grainy harshness and the finish. Right? It's just very clean and crisp all the way through. So I started doing this. By the time he came up to visit me, I had 5 or 6 lagers on tap. Okay. And I had them all lined up. We're talking through them. We're getting nerdy. And at the end, he was like, he goes, the beers are all good. He said, you should feel proud. He goes, this one right here, though, is grainy in the finish. And he picked out the one out of the 5 or 6 that I had not adjusted sparge pH on. Right. So there was just that one beer, and he can taste it. And it's such an impactful thing. And so I've always talked to folks, but my problem is I could not bulk adjust the hot liquor tank.
Yeah.
With that particular configuration. I didn't have a pump to circulate the water. So I knew I could get, like the everything appropriately mixed.
Yeah.
And so what I did was I would take the volume of acid that I would need to adjust my volume of sparge water, and I would put it into a spray bottle. I would dilute that up to 25 ounces, because then that gave me 5 chunks, 5-ounce chunks.
Yeah.
And then I would track my sparge. And so if it was every 50 gallons of water that I would sparge, I would make sure to sit there with my squirt bottle and hit the surface of that mash with this diluted acid. Now, I would get the final runnings pH that I wanted to see. But something that concerned me is when I would add the acid to that spray bottle, and I would add my cold water to it to dilute it, that water would get warm. Okay, right? Now, I don't know why. You know why. So first of all, what's happening there?
Okay. When you add acid to alkaline water, you're converting the bicarbonate in the water to dissolved carbon dioxide. And so you'll see that carbon dioxide will fizz and vent out of the water. And so, yeah, that's, adding acid to water is typically exothermic.
Okay. Yeah. And then that's how I would do. So I would go ahead and spray that over the top. Is that because I've worked at places where it's like, oh, well, we need 300 mils of lactic acid in the mash tun. They would start sparging, pour it in, and it would go, like, in my mind, okay, that's going to get my kettle pH where I want, but it's not adjusting the pH of my sparge water, which is what I believe we actually want to have happening, right? We want to have that sparge water of the appropriate pH to not be doing the things we don't want to do.
Yeah, yes and no.
Okay.
pH is a measure of chemical equilibrium. So when you're talking about the mash, yeah, it's appropriate to talk about mash pH and how that pH is affecting the enzyme activity of the mash and the chemistry of the mash. In the case of water, the pH of the water is roughly the balance of hardness to alkalinity.
Mm-hmm.
And you can have the same balance with two different mineral levels, high or low, same balance point, just completely different amounts of hardness and alkalinity, same balance point. Well, when it comes to adjusting sparge water, we're adding acid so we can neutralize the alkalinity that's in there before it goes into the mash tun and the grain, percolates through the grain bed. So the appropriate amount of acid is in terms of milliequivalents per liter. Not getting into the chemistry, but you're just trying to neutralize the precise amount of alkalinity that's in that water, not necessarily trying to do it by pH.
Okay.
You can, and you can kind of thumb it, say get your sparge water pH to about 5.2. Pretty good.
Sure.
Pretty good. And yeah, that translates when that de-alkalized water hits the grain bed, there's enough residual buffering in the work that's still in the grain bed to keep that, so that this de-alkalized water doesn't change that. When you use raw alkaline water, in sparge with it, then that buffering coming in from the sparge water is going to start raising the pH of the grain bed, and that's when you get the astringency.
Okay. So Ham McVeigh in the chat. First of all, Rockstar Brewer, one of the people that me seeing his content online made me want to start doing pro side content. I have a great interview with him. If you've not checked out that podcast, check out my podcast with Steve Henderson from Rockstar Brewer Academy. But he's in the chat right now, and he said, hearing John Plamer talk about brewing water chemistry gets me a little excited. Are you sure this is an OnlyFans? So it is not. But yeah. On to a question from my man Ham McVeigh. Are there any specialty beer styles or any beer styles that you would think would benefit from high sparge water pH?
No.
Awesome.
When it comes to making wort, we are doing that for, we're in all styles, we're trying to get a wort out that's between 5.2 and 5.6, roughly. Can be a little lower because during the mash, chemical reactions between calcium and phosphates are still ongoing. So pH does come down slightly during the mash. So by the end of the mash, you may be at pH of 5.0 rather than 5.2, and that's fine. When we sparge, we're just trying to rinse that wort out. You can if you have naturally low alkaline water, right, like a surface water source, then yeah, as you sparge, you're not having to do much acid additions or acidification because the pH of the mash is not rising with that sparging. But for example, if you're brewing a dark beer where you have lots of and if you're in a soft water zone where you've had to add alkalinity baking soda to your mash to allow you to mash that dark grist, you would not sparge with high alkaline water. You would just sparge with your regular low mineral water, because that low mineral water is not going to raise the mash pH of the grain bed and lead to astringency. So yeah, there's really no reason that where a high sparge pH would benefit you.
Sure. Well, VIP channel VIP member Andrew Latola asks, any plans to update the water book to cover these hazy IPAs, or is that stuff already in there?
It's not in there because that style didn't arise for a couple of years after. You know, I haven't thought of updating the water book. It probably could stand it. For one thing, I mean, I've been doing my water presentation for like 10 years now or more, because we were so far behind in submitting the manuscript that I really didn't get a chance to put in a final chapter of like, how does this all come together? And that's what my water presentations are these days.
Mm-hmm.
So revision of the water book may happen at some point. They haven't asked for it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, as far as hazies go, just flip flop the sulfate and chloride and you're there.
Yeah.
You know, the you're still trying you're still trying to hit that same mash pH profile. For pale beer like a hazy, yeah, you're looking somewhere 5.2 to 5.4 is your target. And then flip your sulfate and chloride ratio around and go for high chloride, low sulfate. That helps make it soft and juicy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it really is. It's crazy how high some of the, I call them like the hot boy hazy breweries out there, right? It's crazy how high they push that stuff. Like it's to the point where, like in some cases, they can't use calcium chloride anymore because they're stacking up so much calcium that they end up going to like a kosher salt in the kettle, even as a way of trying to stack more chloride. It's really wild. So this brings me to a question a little bit when you are talking about, because you've judged beer all over the world. How often is water the problem with the beer? Definitely, or one of the problems?
Yeah, definitely sometimes. I've had many beers over the years where, I'm tasting, it could be a pale ale, could be a Pilsner, and I'm saying, okay, I'm getting a minerality in the finish, or, or IPA, or I'm getting a minerality that's kind of chalky. And it's like, so check your water. You may be over adjusting. Many other times where I'm doing Pilsners and the finish is just watery. There's, and you can kind of tell they brewed this with distilled water and no salt additions.
Yeah.
Because the beer flavors fade so quickly. It's just a watery finish. So yeah, it definitely happens.
For sure.
Both sides of the coin.
For sure. Trevor Daniels asks, besides yeast health, what role does magnesium play in beer? And we've also had a conversation of maybe upper limits, because John, and maybe this isn't because I'm a little bit a fan of some bathroom humor. Well, am I wrong to think that if you go too high with magnesium in your beer, that you can have some, we'll call it downstream issues?
I know I said that back in How to Brew. You'd have to get.
Oh, so maybe I got that from you. Okay, yeah, is that a thing?
Yeah, I said a lot of things kind of tongue in cheek at the time, but that I really should have quantified more. Yeah, certainly milk of magnesia.
Sure,
is magnesium sulfate, and yeah, it has, or it was a it's a magnesium compound. Yeah, it can cause you to have issues like that. We're learning more and more, and this shoot goes back 10 years to the IBD Institute in England or Scotland. Graham Walker and others have promoted increasing magnesium levels in beer because it really helps the fermentation. Yeast, they need magnesium, and especially in this age of IPAs where we're always adding calcium, from the yeast point of view, they're exposed to a wort that has a preponderance of calcium. They can't see the magnesium because all this calcium's in the way. And so and I was talking to Dan Carey about this at the last MBA conference in Seattle. We feel it's an issue that needs more discussion, or needs to be talked about more. Where getting at least 10, if not 20 or 30 ppm of magnesium into your water, so that by the time you've done your calcium salts additions, and then when you mix that with the malt, your wort has kind of a parity of magnesium and calcium. To the best of our knowledge, malt supplies about 70 ppm of magnesium and about 30 ppm of calcium, whereas in a typical brewing water, we're supplying more like 70 or 150 calcium and maybe 5 or 10 magnesium in most water recipes, if you will. So, at the end of the day, in the final wort going to fermentation, we're trying to get about 100 of each. Maybe 150 calcium, 100 magnesium. That's still on par, as you might say. And I think, and it works well for fermentation.
For sure. So here's an opportunity for you to tell me to stop making this analogy. I've been making this analogy for a little while. Sometimes when people talk about elevating sulfate levels in a beer, they say that it can make your beer more bitter. Okay. Now, I am more of a fan of the binoculars analogy, with saying, if you look through your binoculars, you can have the image that's fuzzy, but that little center dial can help to bring it into focus. It doesn't actually make it bigger what you're looking at, but it brings it into focus. Do you think that's an apt way to discuss an elevated level of or a sulfate focused water build when discussing sulfate and bitterness?
Yeah.
Does that jive with you?
Yeah, I like that analogy because adding sulfate doesn't increase the bitterness. It does change the character of the bitterness, makes the whole beer drier.
Yeah.
So I describe it as it makes the hop character more assertive, more aggressive, but it also fades faster.
Okay.
And so if you compare a hazy IPA, like one of the New England IPAs versus a West Coast IPA that have the same, measured IBU level. And again, and of course, that's not quite equal given the very high whirlpool hopping and dry hopping that a hazy would get compared to the higher proportion of bittering hop additions in the West Coast IPA. But if you take these two styles at roughly the same bitterness level, let's call it 75 IBUs, that the bitterness that's in the hazy will linger longer on the palate than the West Coast will. And that's due to the difference in the chloride and sulfate character, the balance of those characters. In a high sulfate IPA, that bitterness hits faster on your tongue, but also fades faster. Whereas in the hazy, it's a little softer coming in, but then lingers on the palate longer.
Is hazy a style that you regularly enjoy drinking? Or is it lower down the list of preferred styles for John Plamer?
Yeah. And that's, I'm old.
Well, I mean, it's preference is preference, John.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. It's one of those things.
Yeah. I've enjoyed some hazy IPAs over the years. They're nice in the summertime. A little softer, juicier kind of beer. But yeah, I guess I'm old school. I like the drier West Coast style IPA more.
Yeah.
And I was just out in New England a couple months ago, for the NBA district meeting out there, and got a chance to go over to Treehouse and try beers on site there. Um, you know, I mean, okay, now I understand, the New England style. It is aggressively hazy,
Yeah.
and really full mouthfeel. And they just weren't my cup of tea.
Sure.
I could appreciate them, and it gives me a much better understanding of where to how to evaluate them in competitions.
Yeah.
Where we taste so many, and I regularly do GABF and World Beer Cup and other competitions, so I have a much better understanding of what they're trying to emulate now. But I still prefer the drier.
Yeah.
Character.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It was probably maybe 2 years ago. Not GABF, it would have been CBC. Maybe it was a year ago, but I was out at one of the hop sponsored bars outside the trade show, and they just had tons of hazies on. And so I was just going through, and I was getting, small pours of all the different hazies. And I think one of the challenges with that style is I actually find myself sometimes getting palate fatigue.
Oh yeah.
Based on and this is going to sound strange because I know it's an interplay of different things, but I almost burn out on the ester. Okay. And especially like what I'm assuming is the ester / citra combination. It is intense, and it's a very similar through line for a lot of these beers. And I know somebody's out here saying we use Mosaic. Well, awesome, that's great, but that's not really the point. I think a lot of these beers are built on essentially some variant of London 3, what have you, and they're paired with Citra. And to me, and yeah, it's the whole dish, looking at it from a culinary standpoint. But I got burned out on that ester profile, even. You know what I mean? Now, granted, I'm sampling multiple things, but later in the day, I think when we went out, I don't think I had a beer. I think I had a cocktail, and it was like, oh, this is nice to not have that, and I'm not trying to like talk bad about the style, but first, I think it's a tough style to do well. And I think it's been a style that has driven a real necessity for deep dives and deeper understanding of what's actually happening with hop products, with what's actually happening with water profile, and different things like that. Because I don't know how familiar you are with Scott Janish's book, New IPA, but and he's essentially what I've always liked about that book and his blog. He's doing his own research, which would basically equate to anecdotal, but he's drawing off of a wide range of scientific sources as well, right? And he's showing practically how that's reflecting in his brew house. So in my mind, there's tremendous benefit there. But I do think that style has really pushed us forward with some, or at least the more of the everyday brewer understanding of what some of those interplays are between hop oils, haze, lasting aromatics, and things like that.
Oh yeah, I mean, and that's part of what I love about brewing is that we come up with a new style, we jump on it, and then we start trying to understand it. And it really, hazies have driven such a sea change in how we use hops. Well, I guess the original Surgeon IPAs did as well, but our understanding of biotransformation, and thiols, and et cetera, there's we're learning a lot, just due to that style. So I think it's a legit beer style all its own. And so when I don't there's, in terms of a name, we tend to call it hazies as opposed to New England, but it's definitely a style all its own.
Sure. So a spin-off of that, and this is not just particular to hazy, because I've gotten questions about it on the lager side as well, from some traditional German guys, from some American brewers. Uh, there's a lot of conversation, at least within my little mini world here with what I'm doing. There's a lot of interest in final pH in beers. Sometimes people adjusting beers down in
Mhm.
pH post ferment.
Yep.
And a lot of this has some link to hazy as well, because sometimes with those really aggressive dry hopping rates, you can be driving that pH back up.
Right.
And allowing for food safety, because I know we're all supposed,
Yep.
as commercial producers, is it 4 or 5 and below? Is that kind of food
Yeah,
safe
that's
range, I
kind of
believe?
considered the safe. There's a trifecta of alcohol level,
Yeah.
pH, and residual nutrients.
Yeah. Yeah. So what is your take on that? Because it's always fascinating to me. I go to some places and I know when I drink their killer light lager, it's the final pH of that beer is 3.9. I know
Yeah.
somebody else will have it at 4.4 or 4.2 and they swear by it.
Mhm.
And then somebody else was just in the chat a couple weeks ago saying that they were listening to a Czech Pils brewer at a larger brewery, and he said that they hit 4.7. 4.7 is where they want their lager. What's your thought on that? And again, food safety not aside, but
Right.
aside,
Yeah.
right?
That's definitely a consideration. Um, yeah, when you look at most of the beers, commercial beers, generally you're between 4 and 4.6.
Hmm.
And yeah, 4 or 5 is supposed to be that cutoff for, but if your alcohol's higher, then your pH could be a lot higher and it's still fine.
Hmm.
In terms of inhibiting spoiler bacteria growth, especially, what do they call it? Um, Harmful bacteria growth.
Sure. What is
Um,
that alcohol? Do you happen to know how much more that alcohol needs to be in order to kind of maintain protection above 4 or 5?
I don't. I know. I
Not a big deal.
I think the kind of the baseline we're working from is 3.5%, 4, 5, and final gravity of um, less than 10, 10,
Okay.
or 2, 3 Plato or something like that is considered safe.
Yep.
And so yeah, as your alcohol goes up, then that can correspondingly go up. Oh yeah.
Somebody was asking in the chat what I was drinking, and I showed them I'm drinking seltzer water.
Yeah.
So, but continue. I'm sorry.
Sure. Yeah. So let's see. Question was um, pH. Oh, right. So yeah, um, I go to my spaghetti sauce analogy.
Sure.
You know, um, when for a good spaghetti sauce, we're looking for a balance of tomato acidity to tomato complexity.
Hmm.
And so as the pH rises, more of the flavors become evident, and that's the complexity side. As the pH lowers, the flavors become brighter and a little more focused. So you kind of got to look at the beer style that you're drinking. A light lager, base malt only.
Hmm.
Yeah, you're looking for a lower beer pH, closer to 4, because that allows that singular malt character to be nice and bright, and that maltiness to be bright and separate itself from the hop character.
Sure.
As you go to a darker style, porter, for example, a little higher pH now, say 4.5, 4.6,
Hmm.
that allows those specialty malts to open up a little bit. And now you're getting more complexity. You're tasting the roast malt, the chocolate malt, the caramel malt, as well as the base malt. Those
Hmm.
are all kind of in a balance. And that higher pH allows that complexity to come forth. Whereas if that same porter had a low beer pH, say 4.2, those flavors become a bit more focused, it takes on more of a general roast character. Not bad, just
Sure.
not complex as it could be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, listen, I have a question from the chat, and this is always it always blows my mind, but it starts off, hello from Slovenia. So please, no insult. I'm not good at pronouncing a lot of names, so all due respect. This question is from Matt Jazz, and they want to know, for a team homebrew competition, we have to brew braggot. Could a triple IPA work for this, or would it be sweet for IPA because of the honey and high ABV? What's your thought on that, John? When's the last time you judged braggot?
Oh yeah, I usually don't. I usually just stick to the beers. I let the braggots go to the mead specialists.
Sure.
But yeah, the triple IPA, you're getting, at 12% alcohol, you're getting a lot of sweetness from the alcohol. Adding honey sweetness would potentially be too sweet. Now, that being said, if you can compensate with appropriately high bittering, then it could work. But if you look at double and triple IPAs, Pliny the Elder, Pliny the Younger, other examples, they taste very sweet, even though they are up 80, 100 IBUs, and it's because of that high alcohol rendering, you're balancing that bitterness. So yeah, it's probably worth trying, but I think you're going to have a hard time getting enough bitterness into the beer to make it really balance.
Sure. Matt Jess, thanks for the question. Thanks for listening. So John, you said something in that question, in that answer, that I find interesting, and it's a phrase that I've heard mentioned with a few different beer styles. I've heard it mentioned with Belgian beers. I've heard it mentioned with listening to some interviews with some folks that are kind of on the leading edge of cold IPA. People talking about things like getting sweetness from alcohol above a certain percentage, right? So I've heard some people say that if you want to do an adjunct heavy, so light lager type grist bill for a cold IPA, so very, very lean on malt, it's going to be very, very dry. In order to maintain balance in that whole thing, one of the things you can leverage is getting that beer up above like 7% ABV, because that's when they'll talk about some of that alcohol sweetness playing in there. Is that where that perceived sweetness that we get from alcohol kind of starts coming in your mind?
Yeah, above 7. Yeah, that's typically where you really start noticing it.
Yeah. All right. Well, cool. Well, there's another thing on the water adjustment side and the acid side that I have a question about.
Okay.
And through most of my brewing career, I have used phosphoric acid to make adjustments on the hot side. All right. But increasingly, one of the cool things about doing this is I'm in contact with more and more pros, and we're talking about more and more stuff. I'm increasingly meeting people that are using lactic acid and very much prefer lactic acid. And I also know they happen to make great beers as well. Can you talk about the difference? The difference between lactic acid, phosphoric acid a little bit, and how that impacts the brewing process and final beer?
Yeah. So phosphoric acid is really straightforward in terms of flavor. There's really no flavor impact from phosphoric acid because its main component, phosphates, those are already in the malt. They're already a component of the wort. So you're not adding a flavor that wasn't otherwise there. Lactic, on the other hand, has some flavor to it. And depending on how that lactic acid was produced, in some cases, it's a kind of a, You do get a little bit of a buttery smell from it.
Okay.
Or you can get other characters. If you have a chance to smell a bottle of, like 85%
Yeah.
lactic,
Yeah.
yeah, there's definitely an odor to it beyond the lactic sourness.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
So, depending on the beer style you're working with, if if it can handle that kind of background aroma or flavor, great. And I tend to prefer lactic because I think it's kind of a natural flavor when it comes to beer.
Sure.
I think it adds some complexity. But sometimes you don't want that. Depending on how much acid adjustment you have to do, you
Yeah.
don't want that complexity in your
Yeah.
beer, and that's
Yeah.
why phosphoric is a good choice. The problem with phosphoric is that you can end up precipitating out your calcium as calcium phosphate. And so that's where Appendix B of the water book dives into that. And that's what those graphs are trying to show is, there's, if you just acidify a little bit with phosphoric acid, you're just adding a ton of phosphate to the mash or the wort or whatever, and any calcium salt additions you just added can precipitate out as calcium phosphate.
Mm.
Whereas if you acidify more, now the acidity of the acid starts to dominate and the solubility of calcium phosphate goes up.
Mm.
And so generally, if you are going to be acidifying your mash, your brewing liquor or your sparge water with phosphoric acid, acidifying to a pH of in the mid fives, at least, if not 5.2, is better, because by doing so, you raise the solubility of calcium phosphate and keep your calcium that you've added in solution.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I remember years ago brewing in Michigan and now in Southern Ohio. I first of all, and it's also a testament to how accessible you are. Years ago, when I was brewing at Rockford Brewing, I hit you up with a water profile, and I believe it was like on like Facebook Messenger. You messaged me back like right away, and you're like, that water should just make instant scale, and I'm like, but it does. You could get that place by the end of the week. You could have everything shining, and by the end of the week, everything look like a glazed donut. But yeah. So thinking about situations like that where I had really high alkalinity water, and even when I was at Cartridge most recently, it was a 15 barrel system, and so I would be running maybe 350 gallons into the mash, and I would have anywhere from 1.25 to 1.75 quarts per pound, very, very standard stuff. And I mean, there would be times based on grist that I would have to add 500-600 milliliters of phosphoric acid in order to drop the pH of that. Now, so at that volume, my concern was on the lactic side, because I don't have a lot of experience between the two, or at least I didn't at the time, and I don't have the chemistry background or the chemistry under the scientific understanding. I always heard, well, at a certain volume of lactic, you're going to start getting, flavors in your finished beer. It was a concern of mine, since I'm adding, up to 600 mils, sometimes more, into just the mash. That's not even taking what I need to be doing, adjusting my sparge. Is there any kind of rule of thumb? So just off the top, I mean, not looking at a water report.
Yeah.
Do you think I would have gotten into trouble with a situation like that if I was using all lactic acid?
Generally, I think 250 ppm as calcium carbonate of alkalinity. Your total alkalinity on your water report, 250 and above, that's when you start bumping into, if you use lactic only, you're going to start bumping into some lactate flavor. And the threshold for lactic flavor is like 300 ppm, 350 ppm, but that's that anion, not as calcium carbonate. So, people with waters where they're having 275, 300 ppm total alkalinity.
360.
Yeah, 350. That's where I think you're gonna, if you just did lactic only, you would start tasting it.
Interesting.
And so when they do get that high, that's when I recommend like a 50-50
Yeah.
lactic blend.
Yeah.
And that way you cut down on both.
Yep. And of course, everybody listening at home knows, you all know that we're talking about food grade products here when we're talking about these acids, of course. But yeah. So Andrew in the chat says, I got to get that water book. He is correct. You do got to get that water book. I have a couple other questions here from some other Adam Makes Beer channel all-stars. We have Jay Spees. Jay is opening up his own place, and he has some questions. So Jay's first question is, hey there, we have a 2.5 barrel system and a 7 barrel hot liquor tank. My question concerns water salts for the sparge. Is there a way to adjust the sparge water salts to be consistent with the mash water salts, considering that my HLT is much larger than my batch size?
That's kind of ideal. I mean, water adjustment's easy at the homebrew level because you got a large hot liquor tank. You can adjust all of that water at once and then just brew with it and not worry about it. It gets more difficult when you have a smaller hot liquor tank or don't have a hot liquor tank at all, or you're doing multiple brews for the day where you're filling and draining and filling and draining that hot liquor tank. That's where it's hard to do just one adjustment, and now you're doing salt additions to the kettle, acidification, as you say with a spray bottle, as you sparge. That's where it gets complicated. But for Jay, if he's got a large HLT and is able to adjust the water once and then brew that whole batch with it, that's ideal.
Beautiful. And so, because I know there's a period of time where, so I'm using Brew and Water software when I was brewing at Cartridge, and there is a time where it'll break your additions into mash and sparge, and so I was adding salt to the sparge as well as it would break that down, and then later I started just to take those salts and add them to the kettle.
Yeah.
What's your thought on that? Is there any difference at all, or what's happening there?
Yeah. The primary reason we are adjusting minerals in our brewing water is for mash pH. So once the mash has happened, we don't need to worry, and except for pH rise during the sparge, we don't need to worry about salt and so on. We can leave the sparge water alone in terms of salt additions and add those at the kettle. We can correct our sulfate and chloride ratio there. Our concern for sparging is making sure that the pH doesn't rise, and that's typically done by acidification if necessary. It's like I said, ideally you would do all of your mineral additions and acid additions to a hot liquor tank and then just brew with that adjusted water with your grain bill, and brewing with that adjusted water during the sparge, you should still be okay in terms of pH. If you have to do it separately, then worry about acidification only, looking at your total alkalinity of the water, and then, as you say, add any additional mineral additions. Just add them at the kettle, because they're not participating, during the sparge in terms of flavor or anything. You're trying to just maintain your low pH.
For sure. So another thing that I would do, and this is just because it's something that makes sense in my mind, and you can tell me, how kooky I am for it. So when I'm mashing in on my 15 barrel system, I have X amount of chloride, sulfate, and acid that are going into this mash. I would kind of dose that in as we go. Okay, so I wouldn't. I would kind of like with the first third, I would shake in about a third of each. Second third, a third of each. The last third, a third of each. Is that process sound? Is there unintended consequences of that? Should I just be throwing all that in as soon as I'm above my mash screen, and I'm mixing and I'm rolling? Is what timing is appropriate for that? Because I know those reactions happen so quickly. They happen so quickly in my mind. My mind, maybe.
It depends. Depends. That's the answer. Is it depends. Calcium sulfate dissolves slowly. So when it comes to doing kettle or mash tun additions, whether it's if let's say you've got a small hot liquor tank or an inline heater that's supplying your hot water to the mash tun, and I would start filling the mash tun, and as you say, let the water get above the grate, the false bottom. Then I would add my acid. I would, I pre-measure that. I would add all of that acid in right there.
Mm-hmm.
So pH is going to drop low.
Mm-hmm.
That will help your calcium sulfate dissolve. Okay. Otherwise, calcium sulfate takes a lot of stirring to dissolve. Like 20 minutes of stirring if you're not doing acid additions.
Sure.
It will dissolve, but it's slow. Calcium chloride dissolves fast. Baking soda dissolves fast. Calcium carbonate doesn't. That takes even longer.
Yeah.
And even in the mash, and this is something we discovered while we were writing the water book. I had AJ DeLange conduct some experiments.
Yeah.
Where, even though he was doing calcium carbonate additions to the mash and monitoring pH, it took over 2 hours for that mash pH to start rising, because it takes that long for the chemical kinetics of carbonate to convert to bicarbonate to carbon dioxide and so on, and for that chemistry to occur. So when it comes to doing actual practical additions to your mash tun, acid first, then your salts.
Interesting.
And I would kind of add them all at the beginning, and then then start adding the grain and mixing and so on, to give those salts more time to dissolve.
Would there be is there any use case of trying to potentially hydrate some of those longer reacting salts? Is that a thing?
Yeah, if you can get a solution of calcium sulfate, where its concentration and how much you add of that, that will make the reaction quicker.
Yep.
The other, part of the challenge of adding salts to the mash tun is homogeneity.
Yeah.
And where you're saying add a third. Yeah, that's good, because that way you're kind of aiding that homogeneity and getting all of the chemistry homogeneous.
Yeah.
So it ideally we would be brewing with the perfect water, and we don't have to worry about dissolving anything, and the mash would just happen from as you dough in, and it's perfect.
Sure.
But the fact that we have to add salts, we're trying to identify how to get them dissolved, and once they're dissolved, to get that now adjusted water homogeneous in the mash tun. Get it thoroughly mixed.
Definitely. Well, we have another question from Jay, and this one is a specific style question. He says for styles with soft water profiles, he's thinking Czech pills, for example.
Sure.
How do you recommend getting adequate calcium in the wort for yeast health and beer clarity? Adam recommends about 100 ppm generally,
Hmm.
and I would agree. However, wouldn't doing this tend to unbalance the water profile? Is there another method to achieve equivalent results?
No, this is one of those. This is where chasing classic water profiles can kind of get you in trouble, because even though Pilsen has very soft water, similar to Seattle and Portland, um, I had it straight from Dr. Narcissus that the Czech Pilsner brewers were adding brewing salts from day one.
Mm,
Burtonization, even again, this is 70 years before the invention of pH, but Burtonization was high technology in the mid 1800s. It was, and they were doing it. They were adding calcium chloride to their water to help promote the mash, promote conversion and beer clarity. They knew its good effects.
yeah.
So yeah, even Bohemian Pilsner or a soft beer style, you're still adding at least 50 ppm of calcium as a target, and 100 works well as well. It makes the beer a little bit crisper, to
Sure.
when, but in terms of getting good clarity and good performance from a soft Pilsner, yeah, it still helps a lot.
Hmm. Well, that's awesome, John. I did want to touch base with you a little bit about some of your work with the MBAA and whatnot.
Yeah,
How long have you been involved with that organization?
since 2016. That's when I
Nice.
started there as the editor for the Technical Quarterly Journal, as well as editing other books. Um, we just came out this year with Carl Lockert's Craft Brewers Handbook series,
Nice.
and that's a great set of volumes for the craft brewer.
Sure. Sure. I think I maybe was there like a previous version of that, because I think I
Mhm.
had like a 4 volume set and they were thinner.
Yeah,
And when I taught a brewing science class for a few years for a local school, and I used those as my textbook. And one of the reasons was it was very outline friendly. It was a lot of questions and then answers,
yeah,
and it's a very, gosh, I think it's a very instructive. It might sound silly to say about a book, but the formatting of it is very user friendly in
yeah,
my mind. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
That's a
so
great
he
series.
did it the same way. It is, I guess you could say, it's up to date.
Yep.
Um, and one of the, in today's, you know, production environment, there's so many more regulations than there were 20 years ago,
Mhm.
30 years ago. And so one of the volumes deals with, safety and OSHA and, the regulatory side of brewing today, and making sure you're prepared for that.
Yeah, yeah. That's interesting. I was just a local a local fella that's tied to MBAA asked me if I had interest. He had seen some of the stuff I'm doing online and asked me if I had interest in doing a local, like a local, regional talk or whatever. And I told them, I'm like, I think that sounds great, but I don't do research. You know what I mean? And so like it feels and literally we were just having this conversation today and he goes, "Well, listen, give me your phone number. We'll talk." He said, we'll talk about it. And so maybe he'll try to talk me off the ledge on it. But to
Yeah.
me, it seems like a little bit like an intimidating thing, because there's scholarly stuff obviously through
Mhm.
there. I'm a huge fan of Technical Quarterly. And some of the stuff, I think they have a range of things available, from anything from, not that it's any less scientific, but anybody can pick up that paper that Julian from Beechwood did on barrel aging.
Yeah.
and their approaches and tips and tricks, dude, that paper is amazing.
Yeah.
Like, even if you're already making baller barrel aged beer, you owe it. You have to read it because it's all there.
Yeah.
You get the opportunity to read someone's playbook. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter if you just won the championship. You read the playbook because you know they're doing a good job too, right? You can never know enough. So yeah, technical quarterly has some has some great stuff in it for sure.
Yeah. That's what I love about it. I mean, we publish case studies where a brewery is just trying to address one question. They do a short series of experiments to address that question. Boom, here's what we did. Here's our data. Here's what we realized.
Yeah.
There's one in the current issue by Matt Cottrell where the current focus issue is on AI. It was in actually fourth quarter 2023 is on AI and digital technology and and how to utilize it. And he used Internet of Things and measurement and AI to figure out how to get the most effective use out of his autoclave in the lab. Realized that without this AI loop, they would sometimes not hit their critical temperature.
Oh wow.
And so it's just it's every brewer, I think, has a story to tell.
Yeah.
They've seen issues that they've addressed, and if we could just get everybody to write it up, we would be so far ahead. But everybody has a story to tell, and we like to get them in the technical quarterly because, as you say, there's some real gold mines of information out there.
Yeah, I that makes sense through that lens in particular. I know right now at Sonder we're just starting to use. So I have either started to notice or I have developed a pretty solid sensitivity to gluten over the last couple of years, to the point to where I can't drink anything that has not been brewed with. I have found that I can have a few beers if they have been brewed with Brewers Clarex.
Yeah.
I don't know how familiar you are with that enzyme.
Oh yeah.
And so we're going to play with that. We are a packaging brewery. And so that, I'm not suggesting that we do it just so I can drink the beer, but if we can get some extended filter life out of, extended pad life for our filters off of something like that, some ease of use on the cold side, because that's one of the supposed benefits of it as well. We'll see. We'll see. Has that been something that you've played around with or have any background with?
I've only from, I guess, the editing side of things. I mean, seeing articles come across to talk about it. I know that gluten sensitivity is a rising issue.
Yeah.
So, but I haven't used it myself.
Sure. And something else we're going to be playing with, because I was just talking to Julian just recently and a couple other interviews that I've listened to. We're going to do a little playing around with cold side zinc additions. And I'm going to be really interested to see how that goes, because we're not the biggest brewery on earth, but we did a little over 6,000 barrels last year. We're hoping at 7 this year. If you can take a day back on fermentation on a tank, that adds up. That's barrels for real over the course of a year. So there are some things that we're kicking around, and the cool thing is that where I brew right now, we do tank checks 365 days out of the year, and so we'll have a data source, a data log to be able to reference any changes that we make against. So yeah. But
I'm sorry, Adam, I've got to let the dog out.
You're absolutely fine. Yeah.
Okay.
You're good.
Okay, I'll be right back.
Okay. He's answering the question of who let the dogs out. I mean, everybody's thinking some measure of a who let the dogs out joke, right? Am I wrong? Hey, but in the meantime, everybody, we've got some beautiful faces here in the chat. We've got Bruce, Andrew. We have M. I think this is the first time I've seen M in the chat. Ham McVeigh's back in here. Drampa Man. Dude, we got them all. We got Trevor. We have Underkid 22. I don't know if I've seen Underkid 22 before. What else? Rockstar was in here too. This has been a fun one. I have to tell you guys, this is and also Brewing Bad, Scott, Bobby F, Beer Coy, good to see you again. Human on Earth, good to see you all in here. It's so funny listening to John talk because sometimes you forget where you learn things from. And I mean, not that I was like claiming any thoughts like in my head, but it's just so interesting to when I talk to all of you with the brewing questions that you have, and then I hear where my words are coming from having a conversation with John. It just really fills me with gratitude, man, because hey John, welcome back, man. We're just saying hi to the chat, and I was feeling grateful because it's just so cool to listen to you talk. I think I have forgotten how much of what I've known about various topics comes from you, because there were analogies that I thought that not that I'm like claiming ownership to, but like I think I got like even the notion of like the culinary illusion.
Yeah.
Right. I think I did, because I tell a story about my grandma's marinara sauce, right? And
Yep.
it's all spinning off that stuff that you've been dropping tonight. And you know, John, honestly, that's really what I've got for you tonight. I do want to really encourage everybody. There's the Water Book, there's How to Brew, there's Brewing Classic Styles, there's his work that he's doing with the MBAA. Please get out there. If you don't own these texts, you should. It's just a joy for me. And John, I always get so excited when I do these interviews because it's just a great conversation, and just genuinely filled with gratitude to be able to talk to you and to reflect back on how much stuff. I mean, you have to, you in your mind, you're like, oh, I learned from this person. And so to sit down and have this conversation, it was just such a refresher of how big of an impact you've had for me as a brewer, not just on that front, but also the fact that in person, you are who you are on podcasts, on videos online. You're kind, and you're an incredibly pleasant person, man. So I just want to thank you. Sometimes I get a little emotional, rambly, and for the record, I've only been drinking water. But I just want to give you the opportunity to catch anybody up on anything that you have going on, something to look out for, or where to follow you online, or anything like that.
Yeah. Mostly you'll see me through the MBAA, various district meetings and so on. I have written another book. It's called How to Brew in Your Kitchen. But so far it's only planned to be out in Spanish.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, Camera is looking at it. They may pick it up in English and publish it. Brewers Publications didn't want it. So it's intended to be, the new intro to home brewing book, How to Brew in Your Kitchen. 2.5, 3 gallon batches, brew in a bag, no sparge, that you can do on the stove or a hot plate. To really help people get that first batch under their belt, and understand how brewing works. And then once they're in deep, then they can go on to the Water Book and How to Brew.
Sure. Well, awesome, man. I appreciate it. Just a couple of notes, John. If you can just stick on once we jump offline, just so I can thank you again.
Sure.
And everybody, make sure to check out the merch store. Make sure to share anything that I'm doing with your brewing friends and loved ones. And remember, April's live stream Q&A podcast will be on the 4th. So start dropping those questions and start planning on joining us. John, it was an absolute pleasure, man. Thanks so much.
You.
I appreciate you
I
making it
enjoyed
in.
it very much too.
Awesome, brother. All right, well, everybody, have a good night and be good to your people. We'll talk to you later. Bye.
Cheers.